Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Osint Bunker podcast. I'm joined this evening by co-hosts Kyle J. Glenn and Osinttechnical, and our guest for this evening, Global MilInfo. Today marks the start of season 4 of the podcast, which will be going back to the old format of a full 12 episode season, and we're hoping to have a string of guests over the next few months, potentially including some senior former members of Her Majesty's Armed Forces on for discussions with us. As I say, today we're joined by Global MilInfo, who is a very well-renowned member of the open source intelligence community on Twitter. I believe you've got, is it over 200,000 followers, something like that?
Yeah, that's correct.
So we're going to start by just sort of talking to you a little bit about how you got into the OSINT community and what your sort of areas of expertise are.
Of course. Well, yeah, first, I'd like to thank you all for allowing me to be a guest for season 4. I'm happy to be here for episode 1. And to kind of dive into it, I started my open source or scavenging the news networks September 2017. And the most notable was when North Korea tested their 6th nuclear device in September 2017. Of course, that's still debate of the yield and capabilities of that device. But it's kind of launched me to hopefully scatter the networks of finding reliable information, anything like that, especially in the Pacific Asian kind of areas. That's more of my areas of study, especially in college work. But that's kind of what allowed me to get up and going and start hopefully a reliable Twitter network to get the best news that comes forward, get something that's instant. 'Cause I know, unfortunately, nowadays mainstream media sources are not as reliable or as trustworthy, or they're not as concurrent as other networks on Twitter can be.
Yeah, and I know you've made the argument before, and you know we'll continue to make it on this podcast that sometimes open source intel or open source information can augment, if not partially beat more traditional news on a lot of fronts. But sort of where specifically does it really beat that traditional news when it comes to dealing with the Korean Peninsula and sort of that East Asia scene?
Yeah, so that's a great question, because I know, unfortunately, a lot of countries over there nowadays is getting tighter on finding reliable news sources or trying to get the best information. I know it's North Korea. Unfortunately, the only sources you can really find are going to be with Yonhap, the South Korean mainstream media, for any type of internal or external sources on that part. North Korea in general, the only things you can see that's trustworthy would be, of course, KCNA, KCTV, and all those. So, for in terms of traditional open source, especially in the Asian atmosphere, a lot of it is unfortunately going through the deep dives of just finding the follower accounts on Twitter that are not as popular to get any type of dive information. I know of quite a few years ago, there was only one point we actually had a follower from China, who was actually near the border of the Korean Peninsula of North Korea, and they were able to get some information of disputes, of course, when COVID happened and so forth. So the traditional aspect of open source in those general areas is going to be extremely tough, not what we're used to with Ukraine, any type of tensions in the U.S., Europe, all that stuff that we're kind of used to and seeing today. But in the traditional sense of any type of open source over there, unfortunately, it's all dirty work, relying on sources the best you can. You always have to verify, especially in terms of news coming out on that part. But in most cases, it's usually just relying on major news sources or knowing the correct people to talk to.
No, that's super interesting. And when it comes to, dealing, like you said, the main sources of information from North Korea come from, those official North Korean state sources. How or what is the best way to sort of observe them and sort of get that information from those networks?
Yeah, so luckily enough, several years ago, we didn't have really the opportunities or the network that we do today. So I know KCNA actually has their own website. There are some debates if that's actually a proper cover up the true natures of the state media, especially as North Korea is known for their cyber units and getting ways of spreading malware or ransomware and all that stuff. But they actually do have their own website that has the information that's all, of course, it's going to be in Korean. So it Google Translate is going to be a feature on that that is pretty accurate to the natures. In most cases, I usually NK News, which is becoming more mainstream in South Korea. They actually have a whole bunch of experts who focus on, nuclear weapons, conventional warfare, things like that. Political, South Korean, they do have experts on North Korea as well. And they actually do host KCTV, which is a link you can go to and watch the broadcasts of North Korean state media. Those are usually really the two main of actually consuming or understanding what happens from that country. In most cases, other than that, you're mostly going to hear sources talking to Yonhap about what's copying into North Korea, because the intelligence services are going to actually have the best of understanding what's going on that North Korea won't actually go out and say. But in terms of this, someone who is wanting to look in to see what's going on, the best bet I would recommend would be Yonhap, NK News. Of course, if you'd like to, you can actually go to the official media website for North Korea State Media. I know NK News does have an English version which can translate with archives of the Rodong, KCTV, KCNA, all that stuff.
Yeah, and then there are obviously I know there are jokes, at least around decoding what North Korean news is actually saying. When it comes, some of the interesting things at least seen in the past are utilizing the Pink Lady or Ri Chun Hee for some of the more bombastic announcements, just because of her presence. Do you think there are any, like, not saying that there's a cheat sheet for decoding North Korean news, but are there some major sort of patterns that you've seen in the past, at least leading up to nuclear tests or post missile tests? Is there sort of a common thread in between that?
Yeah, so I know the Pink Lady, that used to be a marker. When Pink Lady showed up on the mainstream media within North Korea, we knew something big's about to happen. She's about to announce maybe a missile test, nuclear test, or of course, when the death of Kim Jong-il happened, that was announced by her. So nowadays, they kind of use her for everything. So in most cases, it's hard to really use her as a proper symbolic gesture to that things are actually going to happen in North Korea. So now it goes back to you have to look who's around Kim Jong Un, pretty much his sister, the military chiefs, all that stuff. Because there's constant promotions because he's constantly wanting to internally create his grip on power still. That still is happening, even though he's been in years as the leader of North Korea. So one things I would say to kind of decipher of like what's North Korea really saying, you would really go to Rodong, and you would go to KCNA, because one of those two, one's for internal audience, one's for external. Most cases, the more you hear about is KCNA because that is made for external audiences. So whenever you see something like that announced out, that mostly means it's for us in the U.S., South Korea, Europe, all that stuff. In most cases, what I usually look forward to is who's saying it. So if the sister, she's pretty much the main front of kind of announcing external affairs for North Korea, especially within the U.S. All that that's been recently changed to another member. Within their diplomatic functions there, but whenever she says, she's usually the bad cop in situations like this. So whenever she says stuff, the most recent incident should be, I believe it was in either 2020 or 2021. She came out saying that the balloon propagandists that kept coming up from South Korea, that's a threat. They're going to remilitarize the DMZ, do all this stuff. So some of that happened, and then Kim Jong stopped it. So it really depends who says it, what to look forward to. But I would always pay attention to the rhetoric when it comes to exercises, military threats, and so forth, because it's a 50-50. Most times something will happen, other times we're just breathing bad air from it. But like with the traction this year, there's been a lot of missile tests, and then she's been the forefront. KCNA has been the forefront. So I know there's not one thing you have to look forward to. It's just kind of have to understand the rhetoric from being opening the arms to gun hole with missile launches.
Yeah, and I know you mentioned Kim Jong Un's sister, Kim Yo-jong. Sort of, what's your general take on her? I know her rise to power has definitely been somewhat quick. She was obviously a background character post her father's death, but sort of she does seem to have gained a lot of power within the party and within the country.
Yeah, so she's definitely a special case because in most cases, siblings, especially with the poisoning of Kim Jong-un's brother. A lot of his siblings are either in the light or he does things to consolidate power. So especially her in the last few years have been very interesting how she's been rising so quickly. And in most cases, from my understanding, with also talking with others, that she is more of a hardliner than Kim Jong Un is. So that's why she's always playing the bad cop. I do believe there's probably more in the background where she has probably more support of the military, maybe other officials do. But overall, her character is more of a stronger stance, hardliner North Korean first type policies. So whenever you see things going on, she usually has a front. Nowadays, um, I don't know for sure what's going on that aspect, but you don't really hear too much from her anymore. There is still a few announcements that are made whenever the U.S. stirs some stuff up, or South Korea, especially with Yoon being the new president of South Korea, happens. But you don't really hear too much about her anymore. In an aspect which that could change, especially if a new nuclear test happens or if a new exercise happens, um, she'll come out and make an announcement about that or saying, this was made because of the imperialism of U.S. and South Korea, yada yada. But I know she is definitely was taking the forefront, and she likely is. But in most cases, you still see her behind Kim Jong Un, so she is still in the role that is. Somewhat still powerful, where she probably is making decisions with Kim Jong Un, or not. If she's not making decisions, she's helping influence her brother. So it's kind of my aspect of the sister, but it's hard to say if she still has the power that she did before COVID or beginning years of COVID. But now it's I don't it's hard to say, as I don't really hear too much from her or see her in much pictures anymore.
Okay, and not to put you on the spot, but I think my
Oh, you're
final
fine.
question, not to, yeah, but I think my final question, sort of related to the issue, is with sort of this new political situation in the North. Say 5 years from now, what do you think will be going on the Korean Peninsula?
So that's actually a great question. I know a lot of experts is that they're trying to analyze, pretty much the goal is to keep Kim Jong in power. That's kind of the aspect for the Kim Jong regime. In those takes, I know when there was those talks that Kim Jong died due to a complication, there was a lot of conversations about who would, you know, next take power. And the idea is a sister. I know a lot of people is she's a hardliner, so a lot of things people are crazier for the regime or for neighboring regional power, so forth. But within 5 years, it probably, I mean, with COVID happening, there was a lull of periods, especially the diplomatic adventures that took place under President Trump. But now, with the back to the testing phase, in most cases, we would go into the testing phase, diplomatic outreach, back to testing phase. So it's been off and on every year. I mean, in my stance, it will likely still be status quo unless another president or, of course, president of South Korea does something saying enough's enough. I know President Yoon threatened a preemptive strike against their nuclear program. Like I said, it's hard that any of this stuff will actually happen. Like I said, they know it would happen if something like that actually occurred within the Korean Peninsula. But it will likely be status quo, from my understanding, especially from looking at um, most recent events, looking at past outreaches. I'm under the understanding that most things will likely stay the same. I'd be surprised if they don't. Like I said, the Korean Peninsula is always something new's happening. Some Koreans don't like one thing, North Koreans don't like another. So it's hard to say what's actually going to happen. But at the moment, I would still believe that the within 5 years, the status quo will still be same, unless something that we don't know happens during that timeline.
Yeah, thanks for that, Global. What we're probably going to do now is we'll move on to sort of topics in the news. I'm wary that we don't want to spend too much time on Russia and Ukraine because,
Hmm.
let's be honest, the entirety of season 3 was Russia and Ukraine. But Kyle, if you wouldn't mind just sort of giving us an update over sort of what's been going on briefly in the last few weeks in Ukraine.
Yeah, so I guess the biggest event of the last couple of weeks was the sinking of the tug ship rescue vessel. But I'm not entirely sure what the best way to describe it would be. 1 second, I'll be able to get the full title of it up. It is a Project 22870 rescue tug. That was sunk near Snake Island in the Black Sea on, I believe it was Friday. It was struck by two Harpoon missiles, Ukrainian Harpoon missiles, and as far as we understand, it has sunk. I think last we heard from both sides, Ukraine and Russia were saying there was at least 10 killed, with more wounded. I'm sure the real figure will come out eventually. Yeah, but this is so there's been a number of boats, ships sunk by Ukraine since the war started. Obviously, the most notable was the Moskva. God knows how long ago that was now. I guess months. I think we're into now talking about it rather than days or weeks. It was I think 6 weeks ago maybe. And since then, of course, there was the Ukraine destroyed a number of other kind of like patrol boats and small landing vessels and things of that nature with their TB2 drones. So I suppose like the main point is like for a country without a navy, really doing a lot of damage to the Black Sea fleet of the Russian Navy. I think just trying to think off the top of my head, they think they've probably destroyed a good. I think I wouldn't be surprised. We're very close to being in double figures of like Russian vessels destroyed in the Black Sea since this war started back in February. And again, I think it's another example of when more advanced weapons are being supplied to Ukraine, they are having a difference. As well as like Harpoon missiles, there was the the 777 artillery pieces, which have like a longer range than the standard kind of Russian artillery, and reports from the Ukrainians themselves are saying that they are having a big difference in the kind of artillery battles, which is mostly what this war has kind of become at the moment. It's just very large scale artillery battles. It's not a huge amount of forward movement on either side. Russia is slowly advancing in the Luhansk region. There are reports that Ukraine are doing the same thing, and it's very slowly advancing in Kherson. But there hasn't been any kind of major, compared to what things were like, at the start of this war, when there was, tens of kilometers of advance in a single day on both sides, over the course of the war. That seems to have slowed down significantly. It seems like Russia have, like I said, like I've mentioned before, seems to have learned their lesson a little bit, and they're not kind of overextending, and they're just content to take these towns and cities street by street, comfortable in the knowledge that they have the numbers to be able to do it. I'm trying to think of what other kind of big events. There was the another helicopter shoot down, of course, again last week. I don't think it was confirmed which system was used to shoot it down, but I believe an Azov Telegram account was claiming that they shot it down with, I believe, just like an Igla man pads or similar. I don't think it was anything provided by the West that assisted with that. And but again, like the number of aircraft being shot down has decreased markedly as well. I think mostly due to, like I said, many of us have seen the videos of like the Russian helicopters and even the jets kind of doing the whole lobbing, I suppose, of like unguided rockets. They'll fly forward at high speed and then kind of pitch up and then fire their rockets in the air in an arc to get extended range on them, and also, of course, to allow them then to stay out of range of any kind of air defense that Ukraine might have in that region. So it seems like Russia are they're aware of Ukraine's anti like air defense, and I think that they have a healthy level of concern about it, which is why I think we've seen less aircraft being shot down. If reporters believe, they haven't reduced the amount of sorties they're doing on like a daily basis. It seems they're just kind of not flying over Ukrainian held territory as freely as maybe they tried to at the start of the war. But yeah, it seems the war is kind of, I don't want to say winding down, because it's absolutely not kind of winding down in terms of like the intensity of the fighting, but it seems to be kind of, yes, stalling. It seems to be kind of, we're kind of inching towards almost a stalemate, which, you know, I'm going to hesitate to kind of say who that might be good for and who that might not be good for at the moment, if, you know, if it does become a stalemate, because you know, it's very difficult to judge. But yeah, it seems like, you know, at the moment, artillery is the weapon of choice for both sides, and as well as, I believe, like, you know, the head of logistics for the Ukrainian army came out the other day, and kind of like confirmed, kind of claimed how many losses they've had since the start of the war. I believe his claim. You know, it seems, as you know, as the article kind of said it in, they were kind of saying, you know, they need a lot more help. So he claims that they've lost since February 24th. Obviously, we're recording this now on 19th of June. So just under 4 months. In just under 4 months of war, they've lost 1,300 infantry fighting vehicles, 400 tanks, and 700 artillery pieces in 4 months. So, you know, that's a huge, well, yeah, it's a very large number, and very significant. I had a look through like Oryx's, you know, his tracking of Russian losses in that same period. You know, Russia have lost 707 tanks. That's destroyed and captured. I've kind of looked at there. In terms of like IFVs, they've lost / captured 1,162, and only 237 artillery have been confirmed lost or captured, and that's kind of towed artillery, self-propelled artillery, and rocket artillery as well. Obviously, you know, the real number could be higher, but that's just everything that Oryx has been able to confirm at the moment. Which, as we know, he's probably the most, well, definitely the most reliable source of kind of confirmed losses in this war at the moment. So it seems, you know, it seems like Russia might be suffering on there or thereabouts the same level, when it comes to, you know, armored vehicles, tanks, BMPs, BTRs, that kind of thing, as Ukraine, you know, and, you know, in terms of tanks, looks like suffering almost twice as many losses as Ukraine in that respect. But seems to be doing a lot better in terms of artillery losses. Why that is, I couldn't say. It's possible that, you know, as we saw back in 2014, 2015, a lot of artillery attacks came from across the border. So it's possible that, you know, Russian artillery is firing cross-border into Ukraine. Perhaps, you know, perhaps Ukrainians have been maybe more hesitant to fire back into Russia, at least maybe in the early days of the war, than they are now. That's just, you know, my theory. I'm not saying that's, you know, definitely what's happening. But yeah, so it seems like, you know, for the most part, the thing they're asking for again is artillery. As you know, as I said, they've had, you know, quite a large loss in terms of, you know, the artillery pieces over the last few months. And, you know, with them saying that, you know, like the American not produced, what am I trying to say, supplied M777 artillery. I've had a big difference. That seems to be what they're kind of pushing for, both that and, of course, there is the was it ever confirmed whether it was the HIMARS, that's, or HIMARS, I don't know the best way to pronounce it, is going to be sent, or was that just speculation? I don't know if the US ever confirmed which rocket artillery they were going to send to them.
I think it was confirmed that it was going to be HIMARS. I don't know that any of them have been actually sent.
I haven't seen anything.
Because I think we'd probably hear about that quite quickly if those systems arrived on the ground in Ukraine.
Yeah, and Of course, like the US and others have been saying, like, they don't want to supply weapons to Ukraine, that can hit Russia, which again I think is a weird statement to make. I think it was Germany or France. I think it went France as well. I said the same thing very recently, and they said we want to supply weapons to Ukraine that they can use to defend themselves, but stuff that they can use to, like, attack Russia, such as jets and tanks, are off the table. And I was like, well, surely they're also defensive. It depends on how you use them, right? Like anything can be offensive or defensive. It depends literally how it's used. So that statement didn't make a lot of sense to me. I'm not sure.
I think, particularly from France and Germany, the response to the whole crisis has been rather confusing, and I think we have touched on this before. Germany, particularly in the early days of the war, had a very, very isolationist stance towards helping out Ukraine.
Yeah.
Although to a certain extent that has changed now, particularly under their new Chancellor Olaf Scholz. We're still kind of seeing that Germany is not 100% committed to helping Ukraine. I know that there's still sort of the ongoing discussion about the fact that Germany is still receiving fuel shipments from Russia, and is still paying for those fuel shipments, among other things. It's one of those weird situations where you would expect NATO to be a little bit more sort of unified in their response, and you've got the likes of Germany and France, as I say, who seemingly are not quite so how to put it, not towing the party line, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, definitely. And to go back about the HIMARS, apparently there's an article here that says the first system should be arriving in Ukraine at the end of June. So again, it's 19th today. Any time in the next 7 to 10 days, probably. If this article is to be believed or trusted, we might start seeing them. Maybe not in use, but at least maybe some kind of press shots, probably, of them in Ukraine. So it looks like the US Joint Chiefs of Staff announced that the United States has trained 60 soldiers to operate the M142 HIMARS, has trained 420 on how to use the M777 howitzers, 300 on the M109 self-propelled howitzer, 129 on the M113 armored personnel carriers. So I imagine those 60 soldiers will be obviously kind of training other soldiers themselves when they get to Ukraine, when the systems turn up. I suppose, like, the real question is, how much of a difference they're going to have. I'm just having to quickly do some googling as well to double check the range of the HIMARS, but from memory, I don't think it was massively different to some of, like, the Russian systems, right? Like, I think. Yeah, it looks like like a standard munition, like the standard rockets. You're looking at between 30 and 70 kilometers based on what rocket you're using, and then of course there's it has the ability to fire rockets or missiles, or like up to between 190 and 310 miles, or 300 and 500 kilometers based on, like, those particular munitions, which I believe US already said they wouldn't be providing, right?
Yes, that's correct.
The precision strike missile and the one which name escapes me. But yeah. So they're the ones that won't be provided. So 30 to 70 kilometers. Russia have rocket artillery in that that can fire in that range. So I suppose maybe it's the accuracy that would be the game changer, so to speak, here, if that is the case. But I suppose anything, replacing destroyed stock in with whatever it is obviously going to be beneficial. I guess we'll just have to wait and see, just if it does make a difference, and how big a difference that might be, compared to the kind of Soviet weapons that they've been using thus far.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say that at this stage we are probably looking at this conflict extending well past, I would imagine, the end of this year.
Mm-hmm.
I think back in the early days we were kind of unsure as to whether Ukraine would sort of survive the Russian onslaught. As time's gone on, we've kind of been filled with a great deal of hope that Ukraine might actually win, albeit in a very long, drawn out fight. I think at this stage, as we say, because things are stalling in the way that they are, and despite the amount of equipment that is being pumped in by NATO countries, it's not going to end anytime soon. The Ukraine conflict, and indeed everything that has been affected by that, global fuel prices, food supplies, and so on, unfortunately are going to be a fact of life for the foreseeable future. And I can't really see at this moment in time this conflict swinging either way any time in the next 6 months.
No, and it seems like even like Russian state media are like almost preparing the Russian people for a drawn out conflict. Talking about this could go on for years, and even some rather popular kind of like Russian Twitter accounts kind of saying, the typical unironically saying this will all be over by Christmas kind of thing, which is very well known for what I believe it was what the British kind of officers were telling the men before going to World War One, right? Is that what it was told? It was over by
It'll be over
Christmas.
by Christmas of 1914.
Yeah. Obviously, we all know how that ended up. So, yeah, I can't see that. We're, I mean, as close to it as we can. Literally halfway through the war, right? We're 19th of June, so yeah, we're just over the second week of the 6th month of the year. So we're pretty much halfway through the year. The way things are going, again, I can't see any kind of significant movement prior to the end of this year, but you never know. You really do never know with it's been a long time since we've seen a kind of war of this size. So I guess it's really, really difficult to say. It's I myself have had many predictions already on this war kind of be completely wrong, which is like as most of us have, I'm sure. I thought it'd be over within the first couple of weeks, first month at least. I thought it would be all over. Kind of similar to the war between Azerbaijan and Armenia we saw back in 2020. I believe that was maybe 6 months, 6 weeks, 2 months, right? Maybe a little bit over.
Yeah.
Yep, sounds about right.
And that was quite a significantly, obviously quite localized, but it was a significant war between two quite modern militaries at the time. And yeah, that was over quite quickly. With one side, as I expected on this side, kind of one side kind of walking it a little bit. Yeah, but it's really difficult to kind of see any kind of end game in at least in the near future. But yeah, it's very, very difficult to kind of see how this war is going to end at any time in the next few months.
And it brings us on, I think, quite nicely to another topic which has sort of popped up this week. For those of you not aware, the professional head of the British Army, the chief of the General Staff, there's been a change of command this week, with General Mark Carleton-Smith handing over to General Patrick Sanders. And I don't know if you've had a chance to read the article, Kyle, but General Sanders has come out and very, very clearly said that one thing the Ukraine conflict does show is that the size of the British Army at the moment is nowhere close to where it needs to be, and that the UK needs to start looking at the very distinct possibility that a conflict in Europe will need to be fought, and that the army needs to grow in order to be able to do that role adequately.
Yeah, I mean, if you just look, I mean, Ukraine have said they've lost, what was it? They said 400 tanks in um this 4 months of war.
Yeah.
And I can't remember how many tanks total the British Army have in the kind of active at the moment. Is it like 200, 250 or something like that?
Something like that, yeah. Although the number is due to reduce, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So it's going down, not up. So I mean, like, obviously, like the British Army tanks aren't necessarily the same. Well, definitely aren't the same as the kind of like old Soviet stock that the Ukrainians are using. But as we could all see, they kind of like the technology, kind of like anti-tank technology is kind of like outpacing technology used to protect tanks at the moment. We've seen in Syria and Iraq, kind of like many kind of modern tanks, destroyed by decades-old anti-tank weaponry. And it's the same kind of thing, we're seeing in Ukraine now, like these Russian quote unquote like modern tanks are being destroyed kind of en masse by anti-tank weaponry, which is 20, 30, 40 years old. And British tanks especially aren't immune to an anti-tank missile.
Yeah. We're also seeing a shift sort of in the technology as well. As much as we are seeing a lot of sort of very modern anti-tank missiles being used against these vehicles, we're also seeing some relatively inexpensive and not overly technical equipment being used to great effect against tanks as well. I mean, we saw during the Azerbaijan Armenia conflict, the use of drones was quite prevalent there. We're seeing it again in this conflict, Ukraine Russia. Very inexpensive drones dropping sometimes
like anti-tank grenades.
sometimes literally grenades or
Yeah.
very very small bomblets onto enemy tanks and so on, and it's having a very very significant effect. And as you quite rightly point out, obviously the British Army's vehicles are designed to be very much more high tech and very much more modern than the Soviet equipment being used by Ukraine and Russia. But I think it kind of throws into contrast that realistically, it's all well and good having very technically advanced vehicles and therefore not having very many of them. But in a conflict such as the ones that we've seen in recent months and years, it's becoming more and more apparent that, as you say, the technology to counter these vehicles is so far advanced ahead of the technologies to defend these vehicles that really, by spending so much on a small number of vehicles, you are very much putting all of your eggs in one basket. And I have to wonder if part of the future of ground warfare is going to involve moving away from these sort of very high-tech, very expensive, sort of one-off small production run vehicles, and moving back towards kind of what we saw, I suppose, during World War II, where you have multiple types, some of them designed very, very cheaply and deliberately so that they can be mass produced. Because, as you say, were the British Army the ones fighting Russia right now under the current circumstances, arguably the entire British tank fleet would have been entirely destroyed by now. And the only reason that that's not the situation for Ukraine is because, as I say, they have a significant number more of less advanced and very much older technology tanks in their arsenal.
Yeah, and I said it's kind of become, above all else, it's kind of become a war of attrition at the moment. And if the British Army did get into a kind of war of attrition with anyone at the moment, it's more than likely going to lose. Even with kind of like technologically superior equipment, it doesn't matter if you're destroying 2 of their tanks for every one of yours if they have 4 times as many tanks as you.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think the British Army in its current form obviously is, it's suitable for kind of like operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, in which they're getting shot at by maybe two or three guys with just kind of RPGs at a time, and like the tanks and vehicles are more than capable of withstanding that. But if they came up against kind of a proper modern military with tanks of their own and air support and artillery support, there needs to be, I think, yeah, it definitely needs to be. There's a lot of, I don't want to say panic, but I think there's going to be a lot of rejigging and kind of revamping of the armed forces, suppose, over the next few years, definitely, to better prepare for a more conventional war, I think.
Yeah, as you say, the conflicts that the British Army's been involved in the last 20 years have not been sort of peer on peer or near peer conflicts. It has, for the most part, been chasing terrorists around the deserts of the Middle East and and so on.
Yeah.
Obviously, with that, the design, the structuring of the military, not just the army, we're talking the air force as well, and in some situations the navy on as well as that. It's all been very much focused around that style of operations, and there is such a massive gap between the capabilities needed for a conflict such as that, and as we say, something like a peer-on-peer conflict or a near-peer conflict like Ukraine-Russia is. And obviously, we've discussed it in previous episodes, the fact that in light of recent world events, the world, particularly NATO and the US, are very much looking towards China now as sort of the next major threat to international security. Probably more so, I would argue, than Russia is at the moment, although obviously Russia has made its presence felt again in the last 5 or 6 months with this invasion of Ukraine. And I think General Sanders is quite right that there obviously needs to be some major changes to the way that the British Armed Forces is structured, to the way in which planning is done in terms of future capabilities and so on. Because as much as we've gotten good at fighting those conflicts, that are not against peers, we do need to still have that capability. We've seen massive cuts to army troop numbers in the last sort of 10 years as a result of various defence reviews. I think officially we're down now, is it to 86,000 in the regular army and 30,000 in the reserves or something like that?
I'm really not sure. I think you're far more informed than me on that kind of thing.
But ultimately, we are in a position where Britain has said, yeah, we want to be a world leader. We want to step up and do our part. And we've kind of seen, that Boris, Prime Minister Boris Johnson, has kind of tried to show that in the sort of various visits he's been making to Kiev to speak with President Zelensky of Ukraine. And the issue at the moment is not so much one of whether the public would support sending British troops to fight in Ukraine if the situation required it. I think it's more the fact that there wouldn't really be an awful lot that the United Kingdom could really deploy in terms of making a massive dent. Obviously, the idea with NATO is that it is collective defence, and so in theory, if such a deployment became necessary, it wouldn't just be British troops going in on their own. We would hopefully see American and other NATO allies joining and forming some sort of coalition force.
Yeah. I mean, I think like the Baltics and Poland are just kind of like pulling at the lead, almost desperate to do something, right?
Yeah. But ultimately, I think what we need to be very, very aware of is that the state of the British Armed Forces in the possibility that we do need to be able to fight on our own if a situation comes to it. Obviously, the last time we had to fight on our own was 40 years ago now. Obviously, we've literally just had the 40th anniversary of the Falklands conflict. And that was probably the last time that the United Kingdom stood pretty much on its own and fought a war with no sort of additional support from Allied troops and so on. Obviously, the risk of an invasion of the Falklands by Argentina now is very much reduced. But at the end of the day, we can't guarantee that there is not going to be some other event that pops up in the future where the UK could very well find itself fighting alone.
Yeah. I mean, you say it, well, it's definitely reduced. I mean, I'm not saying that there's going to be an invasion in the next, couple of years, but China are definitely have been quite vocal in saying that they recognise Argentina's claim over the Falklands, right, and they reject the British claim. So maybe in sometime in the future, Argentina, are feeling themselves enough to maybe make another crack at it, especially if they have almost like a guarantee of defense from China if the British do try and defend them by force. Quite an unlikely scenario. I can't imagine China wanting to get into a war, in South America when they focus obviously currently firmly just kind of in their own kind of backyard at the moment.
Yeah.
But China is definitely kind of ramping up elsewhere. Obviously they've got their bases in Africa. Obviously they're making allies in South America. So it is a possibility of something again happening in future, and I very much doubt that the British Navy in its current form is capable of kind of having a prolonged war with Argentina of all people at the moment. We definitely don't have the
quantity, I think,
yes,
of assets in order to
exactly.
Because
even back then,
presence.
Yeah, because back then, we had to. There was a lot of kind of civilian craft kind of requisitioned, right, for that war. And that's back then when obviously the Navy was a lot bigger than it is now.
Yeah.
So any kind of war now. I mean, obviously, we have 2 aircraft carriers, which obviously play a huge role in anything like that. Yeah, like I said, mainly that. Yeah, I don't think at the moment that the UK is really capable of fighting a war by themselves, without any kind of significant assistance from anyone else.
Yeah, and again, it comes back to this whole thing of we have very high-end technology in small numbers, particularly when we're thinking about the Navy. We've got 2 very capable aircraft carriers. We've got a small number, admittedly, of very advanced guided missile destroyers and frigates. And ultimately, we need to recognise that were we to face another, sort of Falklands War type scenario, we are going to lose ships because the anti-ship warfare capabilities, particularly of nations, as we say, like China, are very, very advanced. It's something that the Chinese have spent a great deal of money and put a lot of research into, and they have a very, very significant and potent anti-ship missile arsenal, which is intended for targeting sort of foreign aircraft carriers, in particular sort of the US carrier battle groups. At the moment, I think, were we to face a conflict against, say, China, we would see a significant loss of capability to the Royal Navy, because ultimately it is a case of we've got a lot of eggs in very few baskets. And I do kind of wonder again, maybe is the future of sort of not just armed conflict on the ground, but maybe armed conflict at sea and even in the air, is it going to be a case of we're going to see quantity being more important than quality, maybe? I think we're kind of already seeing a shift in that direction in sort of combat aviation, in that a lot of nations are kind of looking at future fast jets and thinking, yeah, okay, we'll still have manned fast jets, but we can really improve our capability, our reach, and our presence by having a large number of significantly cheaper sort of unmanned aerial vehicles. We're obviously seeing Australia with the Boeing MQ-28 Foxbat, or was it Foxbat? Is that the right name? I'm trying to remember now.
Sounds right. Sounds like
the Loyal Wingman project, as it's known in both Australia and the US.
yes.
We're obviously seeing discussions in the UK about a similar capability being produced as well to work with the Tempest 6th generation fast jet, which is currently being designed, and we're obviously seeing our allies Japan and others working with us on that project. And I do wonder if sort of the Royal Navy's shift towards the Type 31 and Type 32 frigate programs, which are lower cost, sort of less capable platforms, is a recognition of the fact that actually it's going to be better to have more platforms, albeit less capable platforms, but more platforms that are able to therefore be a bigger presence, a bigger reach, spread of resources. I think the Americans have kind of already concluded on this as well, because we've seen obviously the Ticonderoga class cruisers, which were kind of their main sort of missile arsenal ships. They are being retired over the next few years with no replacement planned, and the US Navy's most recent sort of planning review has suggested that the future fleet will be comprised of a significant number more ships, but with a smaller weapons load on each. And I think we've kind of seen that probably most clearly with the Constellation class frigates, which are now either under construction or still in planning, where we're seeing a frigate-sized vessel with well under half, I would say, of the number of missiles of the destroyers that the US Navy operates. Does that make those ships far less useful? No, not at all. It just means that the US can afford to build more of them. It can have them far more widespread. There can be more of a visible presence. And ultimately, should a conflict with China erupt and casualties end up being high, the US has that capability and has the resources, where I think at the moment both the British Army, the Royal Navy, and arguably the Royal Air Force as well don't have that sort of quantity that would be needed for a modern peer-on-peer conflict.
Yeah, I can briefly touch on Syria if you want. I can do 5 minutes on that. Yeah, of course. So the expected Turkish offensive hasn't materialized yet. Of course, Turkey and have been talking about continuing their operation in northern Syria to create this quote unquote safe zone, 10 kilometers or 30 kilometers deep, along the northern Turkey-Syria border. Obviously, we had 2 operations already. We had Olive Branch and oh my god, what was the other one? Olive Branch and the other one, we'll call it for now, have been the 2 offensives, and we've been expecting a third. There's been some movements. There's been a lot of threats. It seems to be coming. Just don't know when at the moment. I suppose that's exactly what Turkey are trying to do. They're trying to keep it maybe a bit more of a surprise. But we're expecting, of course, this offensive in the kind of northwest, kind of north. Well, actually, no, not even northwest. Just mostly north, I suppose. Northwest to kind of take. Apparently, the target is going to be Tal Rifat, which is a kind of Kurdish enclave, I suppose, in the middle of kind of Turkish-controlled areas, to the bordered by Turkish areas to the north, west, and east, and also bordered by Syrian government to the south, which I suppose they have at the moment a bit of an uneasy alliance with, I suppose, is the best way of describing what's going on there. And of course, Turkey have said they want to take the city of Manbij as well. I am probably pronouncing that horrifically wrong. But yeah, they seem to be the two main targets, and targets that have been talked about for years and years and years. It's again one of those things that's been in the pipeline for a long time and has never really materialized. So that's now apparently expected fairly soon. I mean, I would personally expect it in the next 6 weeks, maybe. I know it's not a very quite a wide time frame, but I would not at all be surprised to see it happening in the next 6 weeks, based on kind of rhetoric and some movement that's going on at the moment. Of course, what might be delaying that is there's currently quite significant infighting between two groups in the Turkish kind of occupied region of northern Syria. So they have been fighting between. I'm gonna double check the names here. I believe Ara al Sham is the other one, and the other one is Jabhat as Samia. They've been fighting. I've been really struggling to find the exact cause of the fighting. It seemed that they've been trying to kind of merge Ara al Sham kind of into more under kind of Turkish leadership. They've been rejecting that a little bit. And there's been some infighting over the last few days and week. There was fighting last night, which seems to be left maybe 7 to 10 dead between both of those groups. And of course, the largest group in Idlib currently, which is, as we all know, is HTS, previously Jabhat al-Nusra, and of course and I suppose still are, Al-Qaeda's group in Syria. Of course, they've been trying to distance themselves from that, of course, over the last decade or so. And they seem much more focused on their own area rather than conducting any kind of terrorist attacks abroad, as you kind of expect from Al Qaeda. I suppose the closest comparison we can have to them would maybe the Taliban. Very very hardline, very religious kind of extremists, but far more focused with their own backyard than kind of attacking abroad like ISIS were. So yeah, they've obviously allied with Harar al-Sham. There was rumours that they'd moved into Turkish areas last night. As far as I can tell, never actually happened. It seemed to kind of stopped at the border between Aleppo and Idlib. And just kind of were there to threaten, kind of put some pressure on, as they are. I'd say the most competent, most well-equipped, best-armed kind of group on the opposition side in Syria. So yeah, there's things happening in Syria. Of course, it's largely a kind of frozen conflict as things stand at the moment. It's been a good long while since any kind of territory changed hands. Probably the last time was the Turkish intervention against the Syrian government back in, God, when was that? 2019, maybe 2019. Yeah, when the Syrian government made their offensive into Idlib, and then Turkey intervened on the side of the opposition, pushed them kind of back to their almost starting point, give or take a few kilometers here or there. Of course, there's been rumors that Assad and the government are going to try another offensive. That doesn't seem very likely as things stand. Mostly because Russia are their main ally, are very, very tied up with their own war at the moment in Ukraine, and I can't imagine Russia diverting any kind of their air assets to Syria to help Assad fight his battles when they're very much struggling with their own. Yeah, I think that's all I have at the moment on Syria. Of course, there's still clashes in northern Iraq between Turkey and Kurdish militants, PKK there. They released a video today of a raid against a Turkish outpost, which I believe 3 or 4 soldiers were killed. But at the moment, the kind of northern Iraq kind of conflict is very much going Turkey's way there. Several bases being built there. They kind of control a huge kind of part of northern Iraq, the Kurdistan region of northern Iraq. But yeah, there's not a whole lot going on, I don't think, at the moment. Unless any of you guys have anything else to add?
I don't think so for Syria, but I can add more on the Asian Pacific region if we still have time.
Yeah, I'll do a quick sum up of some of the other news stories, and if you've got anything you want to chip in and add to that, we'll add that before we close. This week, an Iranian F-14 Tomcat has crashed, according to local media. Reports are that the aircraft suffered some form of engine failure, resulting in both pilots ejecting over the city of Isfahan. In other news, Uganda has taken delivery of 3 Russian-made Mi-28NE helicopters. The arrival of these helicopters came as a little bit of a surprise, as there had not been a formal announcement about any orders or deliveries being made to Uganda. But photographs of a welcoming parade for the aircraft appeared on social media yesterday morning. In other news, a Chinese-built Venezuelan Air Force jet trainer crashed earlier this week in Zulia State. Both crew members ejected but are injured and have been taken to hospital. The cause of the crash at this time is not known. And China has unveiled its 3rd aircraft carrier, the CV-18 Fujian. The ship is the first indigenous-built aircraft carrier built with steam catapults for the Chinese Navy, as opposed to the previous ships which used a short takeoff ski jump on the front of the deck. Is there anything else you'd like to add to that?
No. I think you've covered
I think
it
you
as
so
well.
as well.
Okay. And with that, I'd like to thank Global again for joining us for this episode. It's been a pleasure having you on, mate.
Oh, it's a pleasure of mine. Thank you all for inviting me. It was a great. Definitely learned a lot, especially with our new events in Syria. Of course, the ever-evolving situation in Ukraine.
Indeed. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, as always, you can catch us on YouTube. You can download the podcast for free from rss.com, or you can catch us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and a variety of other platforms. Without any further ado, we're going to wrap it up for this week. So thank you very much for listening, and we will catch you again for episode 2 in a couple of weeks' time.